June 24, 1958. Ladies and gentlemen, if you reflect upon our interpretation of the dialectic as an attempt to do justice in thought itself to the non-identical, that is, precisely to those moments which are not exhausted in our thought, then it is clear that this very proposition involves a contradiction. For the identity of the non-identical, expressed as simply as I have just expressed it here, would be a false proposition. We are thus presented with a task. The dialectic could be interpreted in terms of this proposition as the effort to confront this paradox implicit in the predicament of thought itself. And it is evident that this difficulty cannot adequately be confronted in a simple proposition. And this is precisely what drives the dialectic to assume the systematic and ramified character that it displays as a whole. In other words, the paradox of the attempt which I have just described to you demands to be fully unfolded as such. And in a certain sense you could regard the dialectic as a single and very far-reaching attempt, through the unfolding of this contradiction, to confront a task which is given with the very claim to knowledge itself. Perhaps you can best understand the necessity of this thought, if you clearly realize that the paradoxical approach which I have just been talking about is not some artificially confected paradox, but one that holds within itself the task of knowledge or cognition as such. For it is evident that thought or the process of knowing only really represents genuine knowing where it involves more than the mere consciousness of itself, that is, where it concerns itself with something other than itself, where it does not content itself with mere tautology. If we want to know something, then, if you will forgive the clever schoolmasterly tone here, we want to know something, and not just stay with the act of knowing. In other words, we want to advance beyond the domain of our thought. Yet, on the other hand, precisely in wanting to know this something, the latter itself also becomes a moment of our thinking, becomes itself knowledge, and also becomes itself mind or spirit. To know or to cognize something always resembles a process where something other or non-identical which confronts us is taken up into our own consciousness, is appropriated in a certain sense or made into something of our own. And this paradox, that knowing means translating something into identity, while yet relating to something which is non-identical, since otherwise there would be no process of knowing at all. This otherwise irresolvable paradox is precisely what calls for the labor of the concept for that process of both self-unfolding truth and self-unfolding thought, which we understand by the name of dialectic. I believe we have now come far enough for you to be able to grasp the significance of this theoretical explication and interpretation of the dialectic. And from here we can proceed, not without a certain abruptness perhaps, but still illuminatingly, I think, to a more specific discussion of the two fundamental types of dialectical thought, which have been presented hitherto. I certainly do not wish to claim that these two types actually exhaust the entire field here, and I am well aware, for example, that there are certain powerful tendencies of an ontological kind today, and particularly in recent Catholic thought, which also strive to develop a dialectical philosophy. I do not wish to go into this question here, especially since I have already presented you with some general claims about the relationship between dialectical and ontological philosophy, and which I can develop in more detail today, and in the next session through some much more specific observations about the position of the dialectic in relation to the concept of being. Thus I believe that I can justify my approach here in taking the two essential types of dialectic to be, firstly, the idealist dialectic, as this was developed and defended above all by Hegel, although the thought of Fichte and Schelling, and particularly that of Fichte, already exhibits strongly dialectical features, and, secondly, the materialist dialectic, which, in terms of its origin, is essentially connected with the name of Marx. Now if you clearly bear in mind the interpretation of the dialectic in general which I have presented to you here, you should already almost be able to derive both of these two principal types of dialectic directly from it. A temptation which I find it rather difficult to resist, and which I fear I shall not indeed be able to resist. For on the one side you find a form of thought, one type of dialectic where, of the two moments which essentially define the dialectic, the moment of identity is the predominant one, where every particular moment of identity is indeed challenged, where therefore, in other words, thought expressly brings out the moment of non-identity within identity in all of its own particular moments, but where a certain reconciliation is nonetheless effected as a whole. It is clear without more ado that this type of dialectic can only be the idealist dialectic, for the primacy of thought over being is indeed affirmed here. It is thus a kind of thought in which, in spite of all the non-identity in the particular moments, non-identity is ultimately turned into something identical within the whole. And since the dialectic always begins with reflection upon the knowing faculty itself, namely mind or spirit, we find that spirit, as the principle with which everything is ultimately posited as identical, becomes in this form of thought the dominant principle after all. If I may put this in a crude and rudimentary way here, the Hegelian dialectic as a whole, and regarded from a rather considerable distance, is indeed emphatically a philosophy of spirit, or, more than this, a metaphysics of spirit. In this dialectic, spirit is the absolute. Everything that is ultimately reveals itself after all is a specific determination of spirit. In my own book on Hegel, I particularly emphasized a different moment of his thought, namely what we may call the critical or negative moment. But I should tell you that this was already a specific accentuation on my part, insofar as the thoughts which I developed in my book are actually thoughts which you cannot simply take without more ado as an exposition of Hegel's philosophy, as things are intended at any given point by Hegel himself. Rather, this was an attempt to save Hegel, indeed to vindicate him, you may say, in some contradiction to certain central motivations of his own thought. For it is clear that, in a philosophical project such as Hegel's, in which the non-identical should be fully acknowledged, yet also ultimately be entirely resolved or sublated in the principle of identity which is absolute spirit, that in such a form of thought the dimension of the non-identical, namely everything in our experience which is not actually spirit, is not taken with complete seriousness after all. And I have attempted to emphasize just those moments in Hegel which, in contrast, do tend to bring out the seriousness of the non-identical, the seriousness of contradiction, in his philosophy. But a remark which Max Scheler once made about Martin Buber after hearing one of his religious lectures also applies to Hegel: serious, very serious, and yet not completely serious. By this I do not mean to say that Hegel's philosophy is not to be taken completely seriously. I believe that I am hardly likely to court this misunderstanding. What I mean is that the thought of non-identity which Hegel himself so impressively acknowledged is not ultimately acknowledged with complete seriousness after all, so that the affirmative, consolatory and, if you like, apologetic moment ultimately prevails in his philosophy. And this is intimately connected with that aspect of his thought, which was subjected to such penetrating criticism, albeit quite independently, by Kierkegaard and Marx alike. Now for the materialist dialectic, in contrast, if you consider the points we have already made, especially the point that the dialectic is not a merely intellectual process, but a process of reality itself, that dialectical tendency to make the moment of non-identity, of contradiction, into the decisive factor, does not imply that we must assert some final or conclusive identity of thought and being in the world as it is, that is, in the object of knowledge. You can also express this by saying that, in the Marxian dialectic, the experience which effectively shaped it and stands at the center of attention, taking the expression experience in the sense I attempted to develop at the end of the last session, is this: the world with which are concerned, the world with which humanity in general has been concerned to this very day, is an internally contradictory world, and that identity which the speculative concept in Hegel already claims in a sense to have at its disposal, and which is sought in the totality of the system, is something which would first have to be established, and the establishment of a form of reality free of contradiction is essentially a matter for human praxis, rather than a matter for philosophy. I believe that you can clearly see, from these two characteristics of the dialectic, how both these types of thought spring from the essence of dialectic itself. We can also derive them, of course, from the positions of the thinkers whom they reflected upon in turn, namely from the most advanced position that bourgeois culture has ever come to occupy. That, if the idealist dialectic finds itself in extraordinary difficulties in fundamentally emphasizing the non-identical while nonetheless affirming absolute identity as a whole, the concept of a materialist dialectic is also beset with the greatest and most serious difficulties, difficulties which belong in the same domain as I have just been presenting to you. If primacy is actually ascribed to the non-identical, namely to that which is not mind or spirit, in our knowledge of the world, then in a sense it is also extraordinarily difficult to grasp just how we are to arrive at a dialectic at all. For the dialectical principle itself, the principle of negation or reflection, is necessarily for its part a spiritual or intellectual principle. And as soon as one really tried to pursue, in all rigor, the thought that everything spiritual or intellectual is mere superstructure, that being radically determines consciousness, then it would basically be impossible to understand how we ever come to a dialectic. For then we shall have ascribed primacy to something which is precisely a rudis in digistac moles, to something which is precisely not intrinsically refracted in and through reflection, but is a mere immediacy. Thus the concept of a materialist dialectic leads to that difficulty which is bound up with the simplest meaning of the concept of dialectic, namely the difficulty that a conception of the world which essentially involves a movement of concepts, a dialogisth, a thorough explication of intellectual forms, is now in a sense hypostasized, as if it thus had nothing to do with such a thing. I cannot resolve this difficulty for you right here, but I wanted at least to draw your attention to it, above all because it is at this very point that we see how the materialist dialectic could begin to ossify into the kind of dogma or state religion, which inevitably emerges when the thought no longer confronts its own imminent difficulties with full seriousness. But I should like at least to suggest to you where the resolution of this contradiction lies. The concept of dialectic which is in question is not a purely theoretical concept of dialectic at all, since the moment of praxis itself proves to be a determining factor, does not by any means assume primacy. For the relationship between theory and practice in the materialist dialectic is an extraordinarily complex and involved one. But the idea of praxis is acknowledged with full seriousness here, and without taking the concept of praxis, namely the active transformation of the world, into consideration, we cannot actually make sense of the thought that material relations or what merely exists could be dialectical in themselves. And, although this thought is not conceived by Marx as a purely contemplative or explanatory theoretical one, there is nonetheless a theory here. The question involves an extremely difficult structure. And towards the end of these lectures, I hope to be able to explore this for you in fuller detail. But I would like to draw your attention here to one thing at least. If we simply apply the concept of a philosophy, of some internally coherent mode of explaining the world, or even, as they do in the East, the concept of some type of science to the materialist version of dialectic, then we already run into the most tremendous difficulties and find ourselves specifically driven by these difficulties to perform the very opposite of all dialectical thinking, namely to turn an intrinsically dynamic form of thought, which remains critical towards itself, into something like a worldview to be venerated. I believe that I can now present you once again with the real difficulties which dialectical thought poses for us, and at the same time try to elucidate certain distinctive features, which may prove helpful if you attempt to think dialectically yourselves. For the task of any lectures, which are intended to introduce you to the dialectic, apart from helping to facilitate the study of the most important dialectical texts themselves, must above all be that of bringing you to the very point where the difficulties actually lie, rather than concealing these difficulties with some kind of smooth conceptual derivation. The task is not to render such thinking innocuous, but to convince you of what ultimately motivates this thought precisely where it offers you the greatest difficulties. I hope that the distinctive features which I present here may help you a little in learning to practice dialectical thinking itself. The first of these difficulties lies in the way that part and whole must always be related to one another in dialectical thought. This is a claim that will strike a familiar chord with those of you who are studying psychology, for the theory of Gestalt psychology, which is the most widely established academic form of modern psychological thought today, also says much the same thing. But the focus in that case is essentially on the domain of sense perception, and the priority of the whole over the part is tacitly assumed in this connection, along with the idea that the relation between the whole and its parts is generally harmonious in character, or at least is not in a relation of tension. I should also qualify what I just said in the sense that Gestalt theory does also recognize the moment of the non-identity of whole and part in its concept of a bad Gestalt. But the entire pathos of this scientific doctrine of the priority of the whole over the part is incomparably less antagonistic in character than it is in the dialectic. I should like to say right away that the idea of the dominance of the whole over the parts was actually first expressed in the context of the dialectic by Hegel in the claim we have already discussed in some detail, namely that the whole is the true. And then again by Marx in the material reversal or interpretation of this claim, when he argued that the totality of this society furnishes the key to all of the individual social processes, and that independence cannot really be ascribed to these individual social processes over against that totality. But the dialectical conception of the relation between the whole and the parts is actually far more difficult than the very familiar claim that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, for while, on the one hand, it is constantly demanded that the parts must be grasped from the perspective of the whole, and that the whole in turn must be grasped through the interplay of the parts. The dialectical conception also insists upon a relation of tension between these moments, between the whole and the parts, between the universal and the particular. That is why the effort to bring these two moments together actually proves to be extraordinarily problematic and extraordinarily difficult. The difficulty I am talking about here, and which I wish to bring home to you, is that, while the whole and the parts can certainly only be grasped in their relation to one another, we must recognize that the whole is by no means positively given when you have the part, and, conversely, that the relevant parts are by no means positively given when you think the whole. Thus you must constantly ask yourselves how you are actually to bring both these things together, for, as I believe I have already made sufficiently clear, the relation of whole and part in the dialectic is not one of mere subsumption. This is not a relation of logical extension where the parts would be contained within the whole in the way the segments of a circle lie within its circumference. Rather, it is a dynamic relation, one where both moments reciprocally produce one another rather than just being given alongside one another in a reified and, so to speak, timeless manner. And we may say in general that the dialectic in its entirety, to employ a Kantian distinction here, has extended the domain of the so-called dynamic principles to such a degree that what Kant presents under the title of mathematical principles, namely the logical principles, also comes to assume a dynamic character. Thus we are talking about the problem, and this is one of the major difficulties with which the dialectic confronts you, of how I am already supposed to grasp the part by reference to a whole, which is never completely given as such. In order to show you how these things unfold with regard to the actual work of cognition, I could perhaps say something here about a controversy in which I was engaged over 20 years ago now with Walter Benjamin, when he was writing his work on Baudelaire. I am referring to the unpublished opening part of this work, and specifically to the interpretation of one of the poems from Baudelaire's cycle Love in des Chiffoniers. At the time when Baudelaire was writing, the ragpickers were seen as extreme representatives of the lumpen proletariat and thus possessed key significance for the depiction of penury, which plays such an important role in French literature as a whole in this period. You have only to think of Les Miserables in this connection. In his interpretation of this poem, Benjamin had discussed a wine tax which was levied in Paris at the time and which forced the workers to go out beyond the town gates, outside the banlieue, if they wanted to consume wine, if they could indeed afford wine in the first place. And there were some contemporary French writers who claimed, although this does not sound particularly credible, that these subsequently intoxicated workers defiantly displayed their drunkenness when they came back into the city precisely to demonstrate, in the spirit of an oppositional act, that they had managed to do something otherwise beyond their means, namely to get thoroughly drunk. And Benjamin believed that he could specifically discover certain motifs of this kind in the cycle Love in. I would like to leave aside the question whether that is actually true or not. In looking through this material again recently, in connection with these lectures, the details of Benjamin's argument struck me as rather more plausible now than at the time when we were involved in the original controversy. Anyway, the drift of his argument was to take the question of the materialist determination of reality as a whole, which, according to his theory, possesses a key role in Baudelaire's poetry as well, and trace it back immediately to specific events and experiences such as the wine business concerned, cheap drinking establishments, the rag merchants, and so forth. Now I did not wish, of course, to demote the significance of such individual experiences in this connection. But if you consider the idea of a materialist dialectic here, that is, of a theoretical explanation of social facts on the basis of specific material conditions, then it is obviously not enough for a theory of this kind to appeal to such unmediated data about the wine business, or the suburbs, however concrete that may appear, however tempting such concreteness may be, and however exciting and stimulating the thought of connecting such apparently vivid and concrete data immediately with the highest speculative categories. But this is the same tendency, the same temptation of dialectical thought which Hegel perceived in the work of Schelling, and the task of protecting thought from this was certainly not the least of those which Hegel undertook to fulfill in his polemic with Schelling. In this regard Benjamin was more of a Schellingian than a Hegelian. I attempted at the time to suggest to him that it was not enough, where the dialectical interpretation of poetic content is concerned, to identify individual motifs of material contradictions and material tensions of the kind we are talking about here. Rather, the materialist dialectic must constantly and under all circumstances acknowledge that the individual findings on which it is based are determined by the whole, that they are mediated by the totality of society. Thus it is that the individual experiences, however startling and however tangible they may be, never suffice in themselves if we wish to draw social conclusions of a theoretical kind, conclusions which concern the theory of society itself. For the individual moments, as experienced, must for their part be related to the structure of the social totality, if we do not wish to resign ourselves to the mere description of particularly vivid data. And where we are interested in the relationship between Baudelaire's lyric poetry and the age of high capitalism. And this is indeed the first and still unparalleled case of a poetry which is wrested from the specific conditions of high capitalism. We cannot merely content ourselves with seizing on individual features of capitalist reality, as these appeared before the eyes of Baudelaire, and adducing them in order to explain the content of his work. Rather, we must try in this connection to derive the commodity character, which does indeed play a quite central role in Baudelaire, from the structure of society as a whole, and then attempt to perceive the subjective reflection of the commodity form in this poetry itself, rather than contenting ourselves with individual motivations here. I should remark in passing that the distinction which I am sure you will all have heard of but is seldom analyzed carefully, and is generally also forgotten, namely the distinction between dialectical materialism and vulgar materialism, can be described quite precisely in this connection. And you can then perhaps understand what it really means to repudiate vulgar materialism. Thus it does not mean, for example, that vulgar materialism should be contrasted with some finer form of materialism. What it means is that, in attempting to explain certain processes or cultural and intellectual forms, or whatever, by reference to material conditions, we should not content ourselves with immediately introducing supposedly material motivations as the real principles of explanation. In other words, a vulgar conception of economics which imagined that it could derive reality from the so-called desire for profit, the love of money, or other affective predispositions on the part of capitalists, or simply from the so-called desire for profit, even if this is completely separated from any psychological motivations, would represent a vulgar materialist interpretation, because it fails to refer to the totality of the society, within which the individual desires of employers and workers assume their specific significance in the first place. That is to say, even if we assumed that all individual capitalists were angels, or, rather, saints, but were compelled, under the conditions of capitalism, to engage in economic activity, this would mean that, despite this subjective disposition, or despite the complete absence of the so-called desire for profit, nothing essential would change as far as the development of the social process as a whole was concerned. And I believe, I may also say, that many of the ready dismissals of the materialist version of the dialectic, as it is presented to us today, arise from this very point. For we no longer even make the effort to provide an explanation of social phenomena, through their mediation by the totality, but rather accuse the opposing view, namely the materialist theory, of real naivety in wanting to explain the world by recourse to something like the desire for profit, or, as people love to say, to base material motives and considerations. And once one has ascribed this meaningless thesis to the opposing view, then it is a really easy matter to point out that there are other noble and elevated motives to be found in addition to these rather base ones. Now, if you really want to engage with the problem of the materialist dialectic, I believe the first thing you must do is to take the thought involved with full seriousness, and dispel any notion that the world is simply being explained here on the basis of so-called lower motives, or that the striving for profit is being hypostasized as the fundamental characteristic of human beings as such. Rather, you should take seriously the thought of the social totality, of the objective spirit of capitalism, as the genuine principle of explanation here. In response to what I have just said, you may say, you are operating here with the concept of totality. You also say you cannot possibly grasp such a fact in its immediacy. So where do you get this totality from? Indeed, Benjamin was probably quite right. The wine tax and other such things exist. There are quite specific individual tendencies on the part of individual groups, who find themselves confronted with specific things, and, on the other hand, we have your totality of society, something which as a thinker and researcher you cannot really grasp at all, which is merely a metaphysical thesis on your part. This objection, incidentally, effectively lies at the heart of the most important critique which has ever been directed against dialectical materialism, from within the perspective of sociology. I am talking about the critique provided by Max Weber, who did not in fact object, and this testifies to Weber's extraordinary perceptiveness, that materialism essentially failed to appreciate the significance of any higher goods or motives in society. Rather, his critique basically argued that the dialectic is a form of metaphysics, for in claiming that the particular can only be grasped from a total perspective, while it never tangibly possesses this total perspective itself as an actual given, it is always forced to bestow absolute significance upon certain concepts, to hypostasize these concepts, and thus ends up producing claims which are just as arbitrary as those of the metaphysics which the materialist version of dialectic was meant to challenge. As far as the business of the sciences is concerned, the problem is then usually treated in a very banal manner. For it is said that the scientist or researcher must pursue the investigation, must gather, classify and organize the relevant facts, and then also draw upon something like intuition as a source from beyond. And if the celebrated spark of insight is granted, if the beautifully and efficiently arranged facts are subjected to this ray of illumination, then something like knowledge comes about. To discover the answer to this question, to say in this connection how the relation of whole and part must be configured if we proceed from the part while nonetheless requiring a whole which is not itself immediately given, this is actually the difficulty and the challenge which the dialectic presents at this point. Lecture 10. June 26, 1958. Ladies and gentlemen, in our last session, I began to talk in more detail about the difficulties involved in the relationship of part and whole in the Hegelian philosophy, and about how these difficulties might be resolved. In this connection we discovered that the principal difficulty is this: the particular cannot just be grasped as the particular, rather, the particular must always also be grasped from the perspective of the whole, yet both logic and psychology in their current form claim that the whole is never adequately given, but only the parts. We were thus confronted with the problem of how we could anticipate the whole on the basis of which the individual parts must be understood. But in order to resolve this problem adequately, or at least to indicate how the dialectic responds to this difficulty, one which it cannot of course simply eliminate, for if it could there would be no problem of knowledge, the whole really would be immediately given, and subject and object would merely collapse into one. I must get you once again to consider something which will prove challenging as far as widely established habits of thought are concerned. And this is something that we also came up against in our most recent seminar on sociology. For I would like to raise the question whether the whole actually does come afterwards, whether our experience does indeed begin with the parts and then gradually rise towards the whole. But please do not understand this in the wrong way. I am not speaking in the context of the Gestalt theory or the psychology of perception here, i.e., in the sense that some Gestalt or complexes already given while it is only subsequently, through reflection, that the individual parts are separated out. Rather, I am thinking about a much more comprehensive and authentically philosophical phenomenon, namely about how our experience is actually organized, that is, about how we actually come by knowledge in the first place. And here, it seems to me, as if the standard assumption of the logic of scientific investigation, that we first perceive parts, that we then order these parts according to similarities and differences, that we proceed to classify them, and in this way arrive at a universal concept and finally a universal theory, is actually a construction on our part, one which is extraordinarily remote from the actual character of our knowledge or, simply put, from how we actually come to know anything. And there is indeed a question, which needs to be thoroughly explored in its own right, about how far what is called theory of knowledge really does justice to what we effectively do when we know, and how far it more or less presupposes norms which are derived from the sciences and the specific claims to validity which they make, but which have relatively little to do with our living experience. Now science claims, of course, that it must be possible to transform this living experience, insofar as it is strictly valid, into scientific propositions. But there is also something extraordinarily problematic about this very transformation, and it has never actually been seriously undertaken. Yet our living knowledge consists precisely of innumerable insights whose validity or whose truth, if I may put this more emphatically, we also accept, and indeed accept expressly as our own, as a truth proper to ourselves, even if such transformation into scientific propositions proves impossible here. What I am claiming is precisely that in a certain sense, and I am essentially speaking here, like Hegel, with an eye to our social and historical experience, rather than to the specifically organized experience of the sciences, that in a basic sense we have more awareness of the system in which we live, that we possess a more direct experience in ourselves of the reality in which we are caught up, than we do of specific individual situations on the basis of which we might gradually ascend to a view or to a concept of the totality within which we live. and the particular or individual aspect, on its side, is just as much a product of abstraction in relation to the totality of our experience as the whole. And we must critically insist on this as against Gestalt theory, is also, in turn, a product of abstraction in relation to the individual moments which it encompasses. There is no immediate unity between the two, since the relation in question is a process, and the order which is pursued by science turns things upside down insofar as it would persuade us that the hierarchical classifications it produces, advancing from particular observations to universal concepts, is actually identical with the character of reality itself. This latter thought was first authentically expressed in Spinoza's claim that the ordo idearum idem estate ordo rerum, a proposition that seems to me to be idealist in a dogmatic sense, and which we may come back to later in connection with Descartes and the critique which a dialectical perspective must apply to the Cartesian method, which is itself the prototype of scientific method. I am more aware of what kind of world I live in than I am of supposedly individual data. Above all, the moment of oppressiveness, of unfreedom, what contemporary sociology describes with such a neutral expression as social role, namely the orientation of the individual to some particular function, all of these, you may say, relatively abstract things manifest themselves to consciousness in an incomparably stronger fashion than, let us say, specific situations such as parliamentary procedures or the current business climate, or whatever other social situations we care to consider, the team situation, the family situation, and so on. Of course, you may respond here by saying that, from the ontogenetic point of view, if you wish to speak in psychological terms, the paradigm for these relationships must generally be sought in the institution of the family. But, even if you would really prefer to foreground the genetic aspect here over against the philosophical aspect, we should still have to say that even a little child does not presumably behave like a little investigator, rising from the experience of a concrete threat on the part of the father to the notion of more general threats. Rather, the child will first experience something like threat as such, namely anxiety, and the supposedly concrete aspect of the specific situation. That father is angry will only gradually emerge from this. But it is surely the case, if we leave aside these genetic moments and focus upon relations within a fully developed society, that what is actually immediate here, what we first of all perceive, are the general relations much more than the particular relations in which we are involved. Rather, as a dog, for example, will generally react by specifically wagging its tail when well-dressed people enter the room, will act less excitedly when less well-dressed people come in, and will even start to bark if someone like a tramp appears at the door. I believe that human experience generally organizes itself in such a way. Indeed, in this regard I am deeply convinced that the difference between the human being and the animal is not nearly as emphatic as idealist philosophy would have us believe in order to flatter our narcissism and encourage us to submit to the most unlimited moral demands. If this is so, if in a certain rather tacit sense, in contrast to the organized approach of science, we actually become aware of the whole before we become aware of what is more specific, and if what we describe as specific experience is itself already a product of reflection, then we could find a formulation for the dialectical procedure, one which also serves to reveal a particularly dangerous moment of dialectical thought, and specifically of Hegel's thought. For we could say that the task of dialectical thought is to restore the naivety, the kind of perception of the world that we enjoyed before we allowed ourselves to be stupefied by a wholly organized form of thinking, that the task of dialectic, therefore, is to overcome in and through reflection those moments of separation and objectification that have been posited by reflection. I have just suggested that this is a dangerous thought, and indeed when I speak about this danger it is precisely Hegel that I have in mind. For in the work of Hegel, for whom this thought, as I have just expressed it, plays a very significant role, it assumes a particular form on account of his affirmative view of the world, that is, of his belief that spirit effectively wins through, that spirit is absolute and ultimately the only substantial reality. Thus, by means of the dialectic, the naivety which is more or less prior to reflection in the sense of the merely affirmative, in the sense of the mere acceptance of given relations, of given positive perspectives, of given religions, effectively comes to prevail, something which finds problematic expression in Hegel's claim that speculative philosophy makes common cause with religious belief against reflection. And this formulation can be found in these words in Hegel. But it is clear that, if we renounce the fundamental conception of identity which prevails in Hegel, as I showed you in our last session, and replace it with a concept of an open or fractured dialectic, then that kind of demand falls away. But this is surely not the least significant of the motivations behind the dialectic, that thought, in reflecting upon itself, in becoming aware of itself as a means of breaking up and dividing the content of experience, as a dominating moment of preformation, nonetheless attempts to dispel the guilt, or at least to prepare the way for this, which thought itself has actually produced. I have said that we first effectively become aware of a certain pressure or oppressiveness, that we thereby become aware of the totality before we register more specific aspects, and that situations in this regard may be just as abstract as the whole. And you may well respond that this is merely a relatively vague and unarticulated form of experience, which should not simply be equated with the task of acquiring knowledge, that is, with a genuinely responsible claim to knowledge. I would, of course, admit the justice of this objection, and would claim that the specific significance which theory possesses for dialectical thought is to be found precisely here. That is to say, theory is really the attempt to explore the consciousness of the whole, which is always already there beforehand, and the ensuing specific individual forms of givenness, which are themselves mediated in turn through the whole, and to do so in such a way that they may enter into a certain concordance with one another. And here I shall try to formulate the dialectic for you as a kind of program, a kind of suggestion which you may, God willing, attempt to try out for yourselves if you wish to think dialectically. Thus, on the one hand, dialectical thought must always try and measure up the data with which it is concerned against theory, that is, it must not simply and naively accept them as they initially give themselves out to be but, rather, attempt to render them transparent with respect to that whole which is mediated through theory. On the other hand, dialectical thought must equally keep theory open to those specific experiences by which it is nourished and sustained, and in this regard must equally avoid becoming something merely rigid and definitive. When I try here to elucidate the significance of the whole, or that moment which goes beyond the organized, causal, mechanical and classificatory conception of knowledge, there are two things which need to be said. Firstly, that we are dealing with a dialectical moment, and once again I am here translating an important and extremely involved motif of Hegel's in terms of the simple processes of our own activity of knowing, which is precisely only a moment. It is not the whole, therefore, and you should not imagine that knowledge in its entirety consists of such theoretical anticipations, consists of mere theory. If it did consist in this, it would in principle be that which it may always become, something from which it cannot indeed be protected a priori by any power whatsoever, and would simply degenerate into a system of delusion. Furthermore, I would warn you against pursuing something which many, including Richard Kroner, have taken at this point to be the essence of the dialectic, namely the temptation of identifying this moment of a comprehensive whole, which is not yet actually present to me as something securely given, with the wretched concept of intuition, quite apart from the fact that this concept of intuition is only really justified, to the extent that it is justified at all, precisely as a moment in the process of knowledge, not as something exclusive in its own right. In this context, however, I am not really talking about the kind of articulated philosophy of intuition that was developed by Bergson, where the concept of intuition is transformed and differentiated to a degree that what I am about to say is not altogether applicable. What I wish to do is to prepare you for the kind of arguments you will repeatedly encounter as an automatic response whenever you claim any knowledge which goes beyond what we already have in black and white terms, and can readily carry home with us. For then you will hear something like this: "Ah yes, that's the moment of spiritual intuition, enormously stimulating," people will say, if they are feeling friendly. But this response also generally betrays a certain hostility, enormously stimulating, but also rather childlike. For although the serious scientist or researcher needs something like this, and there can indeed be no science without such intuition, the whole point of science is to turn these intuitions into small changes rapidly as possible and to ensure that everything runs utterly smoothly in the systematically organized context of knowledge. I do not particularly want to go into the question as to how far such intuitions are involved in the process of knowledge. But I do believe that to say something occurs to us testifies to a living experience still at work in us. If nothing strikes us or occurs to us, this generally means we are being stupid, that we have no relationship to the objects of our experience, and what is called a merely logical intelligence, one which does not involve that aspect of unanticipated insight, is a form of intelligence which simply turns upon itself without enjoying any relationship to the matter itself. But even disregarding all this, it is quite false to take intuition as a specific source of knowledge sui generis, as a special perspective opposed to other forms of knowledge. And I would also say that this was actually Bergson's most serious error in his critique of merely reflective thinking, a critique which he shared with Schelling and indeed with Hegel. It is a strange paradox that Bergson himself, who tirelessly denounced the tendency to divide everything up into categories and principles of order, to think in terms of compartmentalized little boxes and rigid, mechanical and merely classificatory concepts, should then have packed the kind of knowledge he held to be truest into a little box of its own, and treated it as if it were something utterly separate from the process of knowing in its totality. I believe that this view of intuition is completely mistaken. For what may rightly be described as intuition, if the concept is to mean anything more than it does in the jargon especially favored by composers of operetta, is a kind of knowledge which lies in the unorganized and, if I may express this for a moment in psychological terms, pre-conscious level of experience, which is then illuminated, as it were, by the ray of reflection that emerges at a certain moment at the surface of consciousness. At this moment of emergence it assumes a certain sudden, abrupt or, if you will, desultory character. But this desultory and disconnected character, which belongs, as the logical positivists would argue, to those despised concepts which are described as intuition, springs not so much from the way that these insights have allegedly fallen from the heavens as from the way, and this is undoubtedly what Bergson actually meant even if he did not express it so clearly, in which it properly captures those moments where living experience or living cognition breaks through the crust of reified and preformed conventionalized concepts and perceptions. This is therefore where we really come to know something, where our thinking is fulfilled, instead of simply feeding off the already given and socially approved view of the object. Then we come to a kind of encounter, a kind of explosion, and out of this conflict springs that sudden and illuminating character of what is called intuition, and which has so often been described to us. But as far as the process of knowledge itself, or, if you like, the origin of intuition, is concerned, this is by no means so abrupt. For behind it there actually lies that whole fabric of experiences which transpires in us, and only transpires in a really living way, where we are not compelled to think in a purely controlled manner, where we still preserve something resembling our freedom of consciousness, where thinking is not already simply directed by the norms which it is supposed to observe. That is what I wanted to say about the concept of intuition in the spiritual sense. To say that the concept of intuition itself can only properly be given a dialectical meaning is just to say that the unexpected character of intuition is really nothing but that sudden reversal from massified and objectified concepts into living knowledge which occasionally arises when the concepts from our not yet thoroughly organized or predigested experience emerge for reflection. Intuition itself is thus a way in which the object comes to move precisely through the movement of the concepts which lies behind it. This movement certainly does not need to unfold in terms of preformed concepts and, from the psychological point of view, is by no means identical to the clara e distincta perceptio with which it is generally equated. But I would like to say once again that theory as well as intuition, precisely by virtue of the dialectical character which I have attempted to describe for you here, may not be arrested in turn, for the self-contradictory essence of the object of knowledge is also naturally at work here too. Thus all theory is open and, to return to the problem with which we began, theory is not to be conceived as something finished either. That is a further difficulty, if not perhaps such a flagrant one as that we have previously been discussing. On the one hand, to emphasize this once again for you in a rather pointed fashion, I can only come to know the particular insofar as I also have some knowledge of the whole and measure the particular against this knowledge of the whole. On the other hand, however, this whole is never given to me as something finished or complete either. And as soon as I try and use the whole as something finished and complete, as soon as I simply draw conclusions from it, as they say, then it already turns into something false. And the whole in turn, as I suggested to you in contrast to the image of a circle and its segments, must be derived, in any dialectical theory, from the movement of its parts, and not from some abstract overarching concept. And in fact it strikes me as the decisive symptom for the decay of dialectical theory, there where it is declared to be the prevailing view, namely in the countries of the Eastern Bloc, that this dialectical moment is just what has been lost from view. For here the dialectic has actually ossified into a system, or a list of theses of a more or less, and indeed generally more, rigid kind, from which the particular is simply derived, and on the basis of which, above all, the particular in every case is judged. Thus if we consider the entire later work of Georgy Lukács, who must undoubtedly be credited in his earlier years with reawakening a real sense for dialectical thought. In the materialist version of dialectic, we can observe at every stage just how dialectic in its most dogmatic form has prevented him from reaching genuine dialectic at all, so that we are confronted with a host of value judgments spun out of rigidified concepts simply adopted from the dialectic. We may take a single structure as an example here. Dialectics has a theory regarding the ascent and decline of the bourgeois world, and, as far as the relationship with art is concerned, the works produced by bourgeois culture in its ascendant phase are supposed to be valuable and outstanding in character, but where bourgeois culture in its decline is concerned, and for Lukács this begins very early, with Flaubert and Impressionism, everything is simply condemned as inferior, very much in the spirit of any old party secretary of the SED. Here Lukács completely forgets the category which he once emphasized so strongly himself, namely that of the social totality. He completely forgets that society continues to develop internally, and forgets above all what he once so dramatically insisted upon, namely that the proletariat, as the class which is opposed to the bourgeois class by its exclusion from the privileges of culture and by a series of other factors, cannot now by any means be regarded as the most progressive class from an intellectual or cultural point of view. Thus everything that is substantial, intellectually and culturally speaking, has been played out in the context of the development of bourgeois society, and however critical we may be in relation to bourgeois society, this critique, as far as cultural and intellectual matters are concerned, only really has a relevant object insofar as it explores the internal dynamic of this bourgeois spirit, within which the development of society as a whole in a certain sense is also refracted and revealed. But, in failing to follow this through, Lukács ends up pronouncing judgments which were typical of the kind of high school teachers from whom my generation, when we were about 15, precisely tried to escape, and ends up proclaiming Walter Scott to be a great writer, while presenting Joyce and Kafka as agents of monopoly capitalism. I think I have therefore shown you, in rather drastic but not I think entirely unjust terms, how the ossification of theory, and specifically of dialectical theory, in terms of a living relationship to the object which it would know, proves to be just as false and fateful as any approach which clings immediately to what is supposedly simply given without grasping its relationship to the whole. But let me say more here about the specific difficulties which belong to dialectical thought, and thus pursue my intention of bringing you face to face with the concrete problems of such thinking. I believe that a further challenge presented by dialectical thought, one which will certainly present difficulties to those among you who have been educated in the context of the prevailing logic and theory of science, is precisely that thinking of this kind does not proceed step by step. Unlike the thinking for which the natural sciences provide the classical model and which we typically encounter in traditional and practically oriented science. Thus, grotesque as it may seem, it is precisely dialectical thought, where the various moments are much more intimately connected with one another than they are in the traditional form of thought, which is constantly reproached for being unscientific, in the sense that it lacks the requisite systematic character. What underlies this objection is the fact that there is no absolutely first principle for dialectical theory. One could rather say, and this is a critical issue, that Hegel's theory acknowledges an absolutely last principle from which everything flows, namely the fully developed totality, the fully developed system. But it is certainly true that dialectic knows no first to which everything else would have to be reduced, and thus the dialectic also lacks that pathos of reduction for which truth, as I once put it, is a merely differential determination, or, rather, a merely residual determination, what is left over once we have deducted all the costs incurred in the process of cognition. On this banal conception, what is left as the net profit of cognition, I am being deliberately basic here, is an absolute first, purified of every contribution of merely subjective conceptual labor and conceptual artifice. Hegel has shown us that an origin is not the truth, that an origin, on the contrary, becomes a deception the moment it is taken as the truth. It is a deception because it is not an origin at all, and everything that claims to be an absolute first is already mediated within itself. But this already challenges a view which all of you, and I myself, have absorbed with our mother's milk, as it were, quite irrespective of whether we encountered it in a specifically philosophical form or not. I am talking about the Cartesian doctrine of the clara e distincta perceptio, the view that individual absolutely clear and distinct and mutually independent cognitions constitute the foundations of our knowledge, and that only what can be reduced to such moments can properly count as knowledge. In a German context, due to the influence of Hegelian and idealist philosophy generally, this idea has never become as prevalent as it is everywhere else. And sometimes, indeed, one might regret that this conception, as a moment of truth, has not been more strongly represented, for it is really only through a critique of this idea, and only once we have properly appreciated what a clara e distincta perceptio is, that one can actually make the transition to dialectic in its full significance. Sometimes I have the rather uncomfortable feeling that you are following my dialectical reflections all too readily, because the resistance which arises at this point in the whole of the civilized Western world, and rests precisely upon a certain Cartesian outlook, does not in Germany exert anything like the traditional power that it enjoys there. And in this respect, I would like to say that one can almost arrive at dialectic too easily, and that is probably none too beneficial for the cause of dialectic. Anyway, with regard to clara e distincta perceptio, we must object that there is no such ultimate and absolute instance of givenness purified of any mediation, whether it be pure consciousness or some pure sensuous datum. The proof of this forms the very content of the phenomenology of spirit, and I wish to introduce this basic thought of the phenomenology into our general presentation of the dialectic here. I hope I shall find time to sketch enough of the overall argument of the phenomenology for you to see how this fundamental motif is developed and elaborated there, wherever thought believes it has now reached an absolute point of rest. This absolute point of rest is once again dissolved, until this quest for something absolutely reliable, something that no longer moves within itself, finally reveals itself as a delusive image of knowledge. Truth, as we learn in the course of the dialectic, is by no means something given and is not something fixed, as Hegel puts it. Rather, truth itself is involved in a process, and the object we find before us is itself caught up in movement, and, inasmuch as the object is in movement, it is not a distinct or unambiguous object. Or let me say, more precisely, that it is not only a distinct object. That is to say, we also require a certain distinctness and determinacy in the object, and here the Cartesian moment asserts its rights. We also require insight into specificity, into the object just as it stands before us in its particular contours. And it is precisely by examining this firm and determinate object closely and carefully in its determinacy, that we discover it is not such a firm and determinate object after all. It is through the micrological insight which immerses itself in the particular that what is rigid, what is seemingly distinct and determinate, begins to move, and it is this which also exposes the Cartesian claim to critique. You should not forget that this claim derives in fact from dogmatic rationalism. If we think in a philosophical way and work in the positive sciences at the same time, it is quite remarkable to see just how many notions that once played a particular role in the history of philosophy, but have long since been effectively criticized or at least heavily qualified by subsequent philosophy, have still remained extremely influential in the context of the individual sciences, which allegedly proceed in a much more rigorous and serious way than we philosophers are thought to do. And among these notions which have been dispelled by philosophy, we find this idea of clara e distincta perceptio, which repeatedly turns up in barely concealed form in the demands raised by the rational and positive sciences. Here we should simply remember that this demand, that an object must be given to me in an absolutely clear and distinct fashion, and quite separately from others, if I am to possess valid knowledge of it, effectively already supposes, and this is the dogmatic moment of all perception, that the world does in fact possess this character of distinctness and determinacy. That is to say, we can only arrive at this clara e distincta perceptio in the first place if the objects of knowledge are indeed static, distinct and clearly delimited in themselves, if they are so isolated from all others that they can be separated from the whole and can be treated as individual objects without violating their intrinsic truth. In other words, it is effectively postulated, for the sake of science, basically for the sake of a mathematical ideal, in order that we can construct a systematically organized science, that the objects of my knowledge are already such that they present themselves to me adequately under these categories. Now this is not only a dogmatic claim, for we do not know whether the world is actually organized in this way, but critical reflection on the question of knowledge, and especially Hegel's examination of this question, has shown in detail that this character of objects, which must indeed be assumed if we are to perceive objects clare distinct, does not exist in this way at all. For objects are dynamic and contradictory in themselves and, precisely by virtue of this contradictory character, are actually bound up with all other objects as well. That is why any knowledge which would proceed in a genuinely rigorous manner, which does not simply reserve philosophy for the Sunday sermon, while operating with healthy common sense throughout the working day, will not attempt to salvage the demand for clara a distincta perceptio. Lecture 11. July 1st, 1958. Ladies and gentlemen, before I continue with our discussion of the difficulties which dialectical thinking presents for us, I would like to forestall certain possible misunderstandings and clarify in more detail a couple of points which I may have presented in an overly crude or cursory fashion in the cut and thrust of the argument during the last session. And perhaps a more differentiated account of these things will also provide a further opportunity for me to introduce you rather more deeply to the character of dialectical thinking with regard to a specific problem. I am still talking about the theme of our last session, namely the relationship between the whole and the parts. In the first place, I feel I was probably guilty of some inaccuracy when I referred to the concept of role in order to show how much this concept has effectively and increasingly established itself within contemporary social science, especially under the influence of the theories of the American sociologist Talcott Parsons. In this connection, I said that we could principally and immediately recognize the priority of the whole over the part above all in that essential part of our life, i.e. in our work, where we essentially feel ourselves as dependent upon society, but not indeed so much as real parts, that is, as beings that are also reliant upon themselves, since we have already been assigned a role by society itself. With regard to this thought, I do not wish to take anything back here, and I certainly stand by it, but it should be said that the term role, as encountered in modern sociology, in contrast to the way it is used in Sartre's El Litter Alienant, for example, is generally meant to signify the opposite, namely the specifically individual forms of behavior that we assume in a particular society. But this terminological correction also effectively brings us to a substantive problem. In the last session, as you will probably recall, I said, rather drastically, that we encounter a kind of priority of the whole over the part in our own experience inasmuch as we perceive social pressure more readily than we do the so-called specific situation in which we find ourselves. And in this connection I had expressly objected to the inductive logic which prevails in the sciences, according to which we advance from particular experiences step by step in a more or less continuous manner until we come to an experience of the whole. Here, too, I would not wish to retreat from the impulse or idea which I have already expressed to you. Nonetheless, I think that the comparison was somewhat misleading insofar as I cannot speak in the strict sense, and the psychologists among you will surely confirm this, of an experience of the whole as a whole without also having an experience of the parts, and vice versa. For neither of these concepts can even be imagined, let alone be thought, without the other. This already furnishes a little model for dialectic. We only really know about the whole as a whole insofar as we perceive or conceptually recognize this whole in relation to parts over against which it presents itself as a whole, and in turn, we also only know about the parts as parts insofar as we are able to relate these parts to a whole, such as the visual field, for example. Without this reciprocal relation of opposition, the concepts of whole and part simply forfeit their strict significance. Here therefore, in a quite elementary sense, you can evaluate the truth of the dialectical claim that categories such as these which contradict one another, such as the concept of the whole and the concept of the part, are reciprocally mediated by one another. The point I was trying to emphasize for you in our last session, however, could probably be characterized more rigorously and appropriately by saying that what we initially perceive is neither whole nor part, but a sort of third alternative that is extraordinarily difficult to capture in words. This is what my old teacher Cornelius used to describe as a confusion inside a confusion. A concept which is not devoid of a certain objective irony, insofar as the concept of confusion already presupposes its opposite. You can see, therefore, just how difficult it is to get any firm hold on what is at issue here. Neither the whole nor the parts are initially perceived as such in an articulated fashion, and what we perceive in the first instance is something in general, something antecedent in a sense to the distinction of whole and part, whereby the priority of the parts over the whole to which we supposedly rise, as affirmed in the usual logic of science, falls away, as does any dogmatic notion of internally and thoroughly articulated forms or gestalten, which we are supposed to perceive without any awareness of the parts also being given to us. I should add, in order to avoid misunderstanding, that these fundamental reflections do not specifically relate to the psychological genetic question, as to what we first encounter empirically, in terms of our sensory apparatus, or our psychological processes. Rather, what we are concerned with here is the question of constitutive priority, that is, of whether we must proceed in each case from some first, or whole, in order to be able to produce meaningful judgments. And, as far as this question is concerned, the question regarding the psychological genetic origin of our ideas is not, of course, the absolutely decisive one. But I hope that you can also see for yourselves, on the basis of these reflections, that actually we can no more speak here of a priority of the individual parts than we can speak of a logical priority of the whole. What I should like to discuss here is a difficulty which you may be entirely unaware of as such, but one which makes itself felt all the more tenaciously in the ways all of us tend to think. For even if we are not philosophers, even if we have not been corrupted, as it were, by philosophy, we are still of course thoroughly imbued with all kinds of philosophical conceptions, and it is just these conceptions, which we unwittingly bring to things, that require critical reflection in order to be rethought or rearticulated, far more so indeed than the so-called naive or immediate experiences that we have. This effectively disguised philosophy with which we all grow up, and which is constantly and implicitly knocked into us, as it were, in the course of our scientific and scholarly development, teaches us that genuinely reliable knowledge is that which derives from some absolute first ground or source, quite irrespective of whether this first to which it is ultimately referred is alleged to be an absolute datum, a mere given that cannot supposedly be thought away, or behind which we cannot go, or whether this absolute first is presented as pure thought, as idea, as spirit, or whatever else, which is accorded such absolute priority, precisely because it mediates everything particular or individual, and constitutes its possibility in the first place. Now if you consider this thesis of an absolute first, which is also identical with the entire traditional conception of philosophy, and it is no accident here that philosophy is indeed known as Priority Philosophia, Prima Philosophia, or first philosophy, and if you reflect explicitly upon the procedures which you employ yourselves in the various areas of scientific knowledge and expertise, I think you will repeatedly discover that you spontaneously believe you do have some such ultimate point of reference as an absolute, reliable and indubitable criterion of truth at your disposal. But it should be clear that this need to have an ultimate point of reference or repair at our disposal is emphatically connected with that need for security with which our knowledge as a whole is intimately bound up. And, from a phylogenetic perspective at least, this knowledge is indeed grounded in our attempt to overcome that anxiety in the face of the overwhelming power of nature, which assailed us in archaic times. In this way we strive to appropriate what confronts us as alien, attempt to make it our own and understand it in a certain sense as part of ourselves. This orientation is still at work in every form of what I call the philosophy of origins, for the immediately given, that is, the facts of our consciousness, to which we appeal as an ultimate point of reference, are indeed precisely always facts of our consciousness, and are supposed therefore to be specific to us, to be our very own, while spirit or consciousness, as the ultimate legitimating ground of all beings, is also a conception on our part, and one that effectively represents an ego which has been metaphysically magnified and inflated into a kind of absolute. When we come to consider and evaluate the various basic types of metaphysics, such as materialism and spiritualism, idealism and empiricism, or again idealism and realism, rationalism and empiricism, we may draw certain consequences from this perspective. For wherever some such first, some such absolute or ultimate principle, is proffered, we are effectively dealing with idealist thinking, quite irrespective of whether the theories in question present and understand themselves as idealist or exactly the opposite. Thus this first, to which we refer whatever befalls us, whatever is not ourselves, that it may become our own, become such an absolute first, is at the same time always identified with ourselves, irrespective of whether we think the self as an empirical person or as a transcendental form, or eventually, as in the metaphysics of speculative idealism, whether we think of ourselves in terms of absolute spirit. As soon as I provide some such ultimate or original principle, what we actually discover is spirit's claim to exercise power over everything that is, for this ultimate principle is itself always something that has been conceived by spirit, and to that extent even in dogmatic materialism, namely in a materialism which is not dialectical, we shall uncover an idealist moment, insofar as it believes it possesses an absolute and original principle, from the resources of pure thought. The pathos of dialectical philosophy itself, whatever specific form this philosophy takes, is directed against just such an absolute and original principle. And the greatest challenge, given the intellectual habits with which we have been inculcated, is surely to relinquish this notion, to abandon the idea that we can appeal to such ultimate truth, and to content ourselves instead with what, for a philosophy of origins, must appear and be devalued as something secondary, tertiary, or merely derivative in character. Now this order of evaluation is basically turned on its head by dialectical thought, and indeed already by Hegelian thought, even though, as I have often pointed out to you, the ultimate priority of spirit is nonetheless affirmed within the total context of the Hegelian dialectic. One could say, ultimately, that Hegel remains dialectical precisely insofar as he's at once idealist and non-idealist. But just recall for a moment what I have already explained to you about the Hegelian philosophy in a quite different connection, namely that it does not proceed from a single claim, that it does not, for example, equate the starting point itself with which it begins, and which is also variously presented in Hegel's different works, with the truth, that, on the contrary, it sees truth only in the whole, as he puts it, in the process, in terms of its interrelated moments, that it regards the origin, or the supposed absolute, as actually the poorest and most absurd thing conceivable. If you bear all this in mind, then you will see that the challenge with which dialectic confronts us is actually that of recognizing truth in the process, in the entwinement, in the constellation of moments rather than in an attempted reduction to some such original principle. And this is significant for the position of dialectic in relation to the two major currents of philosophical thought with which Hegel found himself confronted, and which remain directly relevant for what is described as the contemporary philosophical discussion, however pointless such discussion may often appear to be. For the sake of your own strategic orientation here, as I might almost put it, we can say that dialectic cuts in two directions at once. On the one hand, it works against ontology and, on the other hand, against positivism. And, indeed, it creates a specific difficulty for dialectical thought, that it cannot comfortably be accommodated within this currently prevailing albeit regressive alternative. But first, I think it is necessary for me to take the bull by the horns today and say something more decisive about the position of dialectical thought in relation to ontology, and indeed preferably in Hegel's own words, lest some of you suspect that, as an opponent of the ontological restoration we see around us today, I am just making an arbitrary appeal to Hegel for support here. This is all the more necessary since, at very different points within the ontological currents of contemporary philosophy, we can also observe various attempts to reclaim Hegel as an ontological thinker. Heidegger himself had already announced a similar approach in his early work on Duns Scotus, which indeed contains a kind of heartfelt declaration of sympathy with Hegel, and Heidegger's later work Hall's Wedge or Forest Trails also contains an elaborate and somewhat cautionary interpretation, somewhat reminiscent of the discussion of the two sophists in the Gorgias, of the introduction to the phenomenology of spirit, and especially of the title Hegel originally intended for the work, which one critical edition of the book would happily restore. And similarly, in very different places within the reconstruction of Thomistic or scholastic ontology in general which has been undertaken today, we repeatedly find attempts to incorporate Hegel in some way, attempts which are anything but contemptible since they clearly betray a dissatisfaction with any static or rigid form of ontology, but which are also extremely difficult to combine with Hegel's own philosophical intentions. It is true that Hegel's philosophy, at least in one work, and perhaps his most impressive, namely the Logic, does begin with the concept of being. And it is also true that there is a sense in which we may regard Hegelian philosophy with some justification, since logic and metaphysics are here supposed to be the same, as an explication or interpretation of being as a whole, where being is expressly understood dynamically, namely as life, as my friend Herbert Marcuse has tried to show in his own book on Hegel and ontology. But I nonetheless believe that such a characterization of Hegel, although it may be correct form later, is ultimately incompatible with the essence of Hegelian philosophy, since it would itself inevitably exhibit that character of abstractness, namely that form of universality and particularity which is specifically criticized by Hegelian thought. But I would also like to introduce a terminological observation here which may prove helpful to you in your own reading of Hegel's texts. For the concept of the abstract in Hegel is by no means restricted to what we generally understand by the term abstract. The abstract in Hegel is not merely that empty universality in contrast to the specific individual contents which go to make it up, although this concept of abstractness is not absent from Hegel either. And in our next session, we shall read a passage from the Phenomenology of Spirit, where this very concept of abstractness is in question. But if you recall that, for Hegelian philosophy, the merely aconceptual, the this there which is not yet aware of its own mediation, the t, is just as empty and indeterminate as the emptiest and most generic of concepts, then you will understand that the concept of the abstract in Hegel may sometimes signify the very opposite of what it means in ordinary speech, namely that which is merely isolated, which is not yet reflected into itself, where through this reflection into itself, through this unfolding of its own indwelling contradictions, it would know itself in its relation to the whole. The non-conceptual, the isolated particular which has been arbitrarily broken off, as this forms the content, to a considerable degree, of the positive sciences, is therefore just as exposed to the verdict of mere abstractness as is the empty universal concept. Thus the uninitiated, and as yet uninstructed reader is confronted with the astonishing paradox that precisely what we are used to regarding as concrete, namely the individual data, the individual facts with which our knowledge begins, very often appears as the abstract, whereas the concept in the specifically Hegelian sense, namely in the sense of the particular or individual which comes to comprehend itself, then effectively bears the attribute of the concrete. In this sense it may therefore be said that such a general characterization of being as we have just mentioned, even if this is formally correct, even if we might say that the entire conception of being in Hegel is precisely that of an internally dynamic, and indeed internally contradictory totality, is also false insofar as every such isolated proposition, every such isolated claim, is itself false. And what Hegel would fundamentally hold against ontology, any philosophy of being which now believes it possesses the absolute in the concept of being or in being itself, is not the thought that being is indeed a dynamic totality but, rather, that such a determination of being is one-sided insofar as it remains unfolded, is not rendered explicit. But since for Hegel the explication of concepts, the process through which these concepts become conscious of themselves, is for its part an element of their own truth, such an abstract determination of being, however correct it may initially appear, however correct in itself it may also be, it is nonetheless inadequate for itself, that is, according to the measure of its own reflection into itself, and thereby precisely false. But this thought, which should now be clear to you after all that we have already discussed, leads in concentrated form to a range of formulations in Hegel, which are so trenchant, that we cannot fail to recognize the pathos of this philosophy. It is directed against the idea that philosophy should find its absolute in such an abstract, isolated and hypostasized concept as that of being as such. I would just like to offer you a couple of examples one after another to show how this critical motif is developed by Hegel in a particularly concentrated way. Thus at that point in the logic where being is identified with nothing, Hegel writes, in its indeterminate immediacy it is equal only to itself. In other words, once being is expressed in its immediacy, it contains no moment of non-identity. It is pure indeterminateness and emptiness. There is nothing to be intuited in it, if one can speak here of intuition, or it is only this pure, empty intuiting itself. Just as little as anything to be thought in it, or it is equally only this empty thinking. Being, the indeterminate immediate is in fact nothing, and neither more nor less than nothing. But I think I should also add something else here in order to clarify this point. One must always read Hegel in a very differentiated manner, and above all with a constant readiness to think through all the possibilities harbored within a concept, just as Nietzsche later wished his own readers to do. Now you might be tempted to read this passage merely as a logical treatise, as if it meant to say simply that the concept of being, precisely in its complete abstractness and lack of content, in its immediacy, passes over directly into the concept of nothing, as you may see for yourself in any standard manual of philosophy, where the first stage of the Hegelian dialectic is being described. But you would fail to understand this passage properly if you did read it in this way. For the prevailing tone here also gives us to understand that the concept of being itself, if it is deployed without going beyond it, that is, without releasing the process contained within the concept of being itself, is nugatory as a concept, that is, as a medium of cognition or as the ultimate substrate of philosophy. In other words, the assertion that being is nothing bears a double face for Hegel. On the one hand, it signifies precisely what I have just suggested to you, namely that the abstractness of the concept of being means that it cannot be distinguished from the concept of nothing and passes over into its own opposite. That is what you may call the logical metaphysical side of the concept, and the famous claim that Hegelian philosophy is a logic and metaphysics in one can perhaps nowhere be better understood than here in this connection. On the other hand, however, You should also bear in mind that a proposition such as being is nothing is also a critical proposition, which tells us that, as long as we talk simply about being without actually unfolding the life of this concept in its own meaning, then all our talk of being is worth nothing at all, and the absolute we believe we have within our grasp is nothing but a mirage. Again, I have certainly not been reading anything into Hegel here, as I can clearly substantiate with reference to a passage from the encyclopedia which I shall now read out for you. The point here is to show that what this doctrine represents is less an ontological quality of being than the deficiency of any philosophical thought which simply terminates in being. Thus, when being is expressed as a predicate of the absolute, this provides the first definition of the latter, namely the absolute beginning as understood by a philosophy which seeks the beginning or first principle, as understood by prima philosophia. Thus the absolute, or that which is utterly first, is being. This is, in the thought, the absolutely first, most abstract i.e., which still lacks its fulfillment through a process of explication, and most impoverished definition, and, by specifically introducing the notion of impoverishment at this point, Hegel also clearly shows that he is criticizing the use of the concept of being, however necessary it may be for the subsequent process of dialectical unfolding. That is, he is telling us that he regards a proposition such as the absolute is being as false. But since this proposition provides the very form of a philosophy of origins, which itself necessarily underlies every ontological intention, it also implies a repudiation of the possibility of ontology, of that which today is so often invoked in its name. To conclude, I shall read you another passage from Hegel, one which is expressly directed against Jacobi, whose philosophy of immediate intuition indeed roughly corresponded in his time to the meaning of the philosophies of origins of our own time, insofar as the latter are developed from the idea of categorical intuition. And you will see how much this critique of the concept of being amounts in effect to a critique of any kind of ontology. Hegel writes, with this totally abstract purity of continuity, that is, with this indeterminateness and emptiness of representation, it is indifferent whether one names this abstraction space or pure intuition or pure thought. It is altogether the same as what an Indian calls Brahma, when for years on end, looking only at the tip of his nose, externally motionless and equally unmoved in sensation, representation, fantasy, desire, and so on, he inwardly says only Om, 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 or else says nothing at all. This dull, empty consciousness, taken as consciousness, is just this, being. You will know that it has become common these days to return to the standard orthography of Hegel's time and write sen as seen, or being as being, and thus effectively to remove the concept from the realm of discursive thought and turn it into a magical word that is precisely meant to designate the absolute in an immediate fashion. There is no doubt, so I am convinced, that Hegel has no other word or expression for this being than precisely Om. That is to say, he would actually see here nothing but a reversion to mere mythology, or an abandonment and betrayal of all that Western civilization has effectively struggled to achieve in the course of its conscious development. And any attempt to present Hegelian philosophy as genuinely compatible with such philosophy strikes me only as a sophistical attempt to cover one's own questionable maneuvers with the authority of a thinker, whose substantial concern is essentially the substance of reason, and who is here being harnessed for philosophical purposes whose substance is, rather, the renunciation of reason itself. That is all for now regarding the question of Hegel and ontology. But here I should also like to say something about the relationship between Hegel and positivism, and this may perhaps prove the most difficult point to grasp in this context. For if my experience of the cultural and intellectual climate to which the young in particular are exposed today is not entirely mistaken, I believe that a kind of bifurcated thinking prevails, or is at least latently present, among the younger generation in this connection. Thus you may effectively say, well, of course, metaphysics, that's basically ontology, where there must be some eternal values, or an absolute principle of some kind, and if there is no such thing, then we are left with nothing but mere facts. That is to say, there is actually nothing but what the positive sciences ascertain in their methodical way, and anything else must be shunned as illusion. But it is precisely my innermost purpose in these lectures to show you the problem with this alternative, either metaphysics, on the one hand, and metaphysics amounts to a rigid doctrine of being and of invariant eternal values, or science, as an exclusive orientation to what is the case, and tertium non datur. To show you that this rigid alternative is itself the expression of the reified consciousness of today, which demands official documentation for every thought, which requires us to ask of every thought, excuse me, but where exactly do you belong? If you are metaphysical, you must be concerned with being. If you are scientific, you must be concerned with positive facts, and that is that. But this very way of thinking in terms of said and rigidified alternatives seems to me to embody the fateful character of the contemporary state of consciousness in general. In these lectures I should like, in however modest a fashion, to do my part in breaking the power of this idea in you, in helping you to see that avoiding an orientation to being certainly does not mean falling into an obstinate cult of the scientific facts. Again, on the other hand, when we are overcome by a tedium sine die, when we are no longer satisfied simply with registering facts, we are not necessarily or unconditionally forced to seek nourishment from some preordained metaphysics of being which is conveniently served up for us. But, if you are to work your way through and beyond this alternative, you must resist the conviction that all this is somehow already prepared for you, that these two alternatives are there waiting for you, and you just have to decide for metaphysics or for positivism, rather like choosing between Adenauer and Alenhor in an election. Rather, you must recognize that this is precisely how reified thought itself, how the power of the administered world, has effectively compelled our own consciousness to think in terms of such pre-given alternatives. And that is why it is so important for us, I believe, to distinguish dialectic just as vigorously from positivism, as from that impoverished parody of metaphysics represented by contemporary forms of ontology. But please do not understand this to mean that dialectic is distinguished from positivism essentially, by taking the dish of facts which is served to us by the special sciences, and then spicing it up with the sauce of faith, of meaning, of some higher principle. Likewise, it strikes me as a boundless misunderstanding of any consciousness that cannot find nourishment in mere facts to imagine that every thought which goes beyond a mere factum just amounts to saying, well, yes, this all has some kind of meaning. Everything is arranged for the best, and we just have to be satisfied and content with it as it is. On the contrary, what goes beyond mere facticity in the eyes of dialectic, what bestows on dialectic its metaphysical right to life, is the very opposite of this. It is precisely the rebellion against the idea that the world of facts to which we have been bound, and which is utterly meaningless, should have the last word in our existence. Dialectic is the attempt, precisely in and through the critique of this world of facts which holds sway over us, to perceive the possibility of something else, without this world of facts itself being in the least transfigured by us in the process. As it turns out, I shall not be able, today, to explore the relationship between dialectic and positivism in any detail. But I would just like to say to you here today that the difference between dialectical and positivistic thinking should at least be evident to you by now. Dialectical thought is distinguished from positivist thought in that it is anything but natural in character. What I mean is this. If we do think dialectically, this cannot mean that, faced with the temptations of metaphysics, we simply cling instead to a kind of ordinary human common sense, or turn to some kind of self-styled common sense philosophy. It is rather the reverse, and here I come to another challenge which is posed by dialectical thinking. The challenge of dialectical thinking, at this point, consists essentially in this: you must cast overboard the established habits of thought with which you are so familiar, and take upon yourselves the labor and exertion of the concept, and indeed in this very precise sense, that you come to recognize how everything which is given to us so naturally, that we have no doubts about it, is not for its part something natural. For you will recognize it as something already reflected within itself, or, expressed in materialist terms, as something which is already socially mediated within itself. And what presents itself to us as nature is thus in true second nature, rather than first nature. Thus you will recognize that, specifically in order to allow a damaged and oppressed nature what belongs to it, we must not allow ourselves to be blinded precisely by that semblance of naturalness, which a rigid world of conventionalized perceptions requires us at every quarter to accept. And in our next session I shall say something further about this, and about the critical intention of thought in contrast to the uncritical and merely accommodating posture of positivism. Lecture 12. July 3, 1958. Ladies and gentlemen, in the last session, and in this connection,